Welcome to the Deep Dive.
It's good to be here.
Today, we've got one of those really fascinating situations where a government official scores what should be a clear, verifiable diplomatic win.
Right.
But then it immediately backfires and becomes this huge political liability for him at home.
It's a classic case of winning the battle, but, well, maybe not the war.
Exactly. We have this really compelling stack of sources today, and they all center on a very specific flashpoint from the Caribbean. It's a formal, very detailed statement. It's issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Antigua and Barbuda.
Okay.
And it was supposed to just, correct the record on something.
Yeah.
But instead, it just ripped open this much larger, much more vicious domestic political fight.
And that distinction is so critical here. It really sets the entire stage for what we're going to talk about.
Right.
So our mission today, it's kind of twofold. First, we have to do a really rigorous audit of this official statement.
Okay.
We have to look critically at the factual claims, the legal processes they mention, specifically around a U.S. visa case that was supposedly canceled.
We need to figure out who won the fax war.
We do. But then second, and I think this is the more compelling part, we have to analyze the public reaction to it.
Yeah.
Because that reaction seems to reveal this entirely different and frankly more volatile set of internal political dynamics.
So this deep dive is really designed to give you, the listener, the context to understand not just, the complexities of international visa rules,
But also the irony of it, the irony of proving you're really competent at your job, only to have that competence highlight your own, your perceived internal weakness.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're starting with a specific date.
We are.
January 5, 2026, and a very, very firm official denial.
Right. The government, specifically the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is responding directly to an article published that day in the local media.
The Antigua Observer.
That's the one. And it's an unusual level of official attention for what, on the surface, seems to be about a single person's visa application.
That's what jumped out at me. There's clearly more going on here.
Oh, absolutely. So the initial allegation in the Observer, it was extremely pointed, and it was potentially devastating to the government's credibility. The article made two really critical claims that turned a private immigration issue into a public crisis.
Okay, what were they?
First, it alleged that a specific student visa had been canceled.
Canceled. Not just denied, but canceled.
A key word.
Right.
And second, and this is the really politically charged part, the article alleged that this cancellation was a direct result of Presidential Proclamation 1998.
And that second point, that's the real stinger, isn't it?
It is.
Because the sources show that the article went even further. It suggested this cancellation flew directly in the face of assurances the government of Antigua and Barbuda had already given.
Exactly. They had apparently gone on record, assured the public that visas issued before a certain date, January 4, 2026, would be respected.
That they'd be unaffected by any new U.S. policy changes.
Presumably including this proclamation. So the Observer was basically implying one of two things.
Okay.
Either the government had been dishonest in its assurances, which is bad enough,
Right.
or, and this is maybe worse, it had failed in its sovereign duty to protect its own citizens from a specific punitive U.S. foreign policy action.
That is a serious charge. It undermines public trust in their entire diplomatic machine.
In their competence, their integrity, everything.
So given the gravity of that, it's really no surprise that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chet Greene, came out swinging.
He did. This was an immediate and categorical rejection. This wasn't some soft press release.
No, this was a political counterattack.
And the language they used is key here. They didn't just say the article was inaccurate.
Yeah.
They used the strongest possible terms, false and deliberately misleading.
Deliberately misleading.
And they went even further. They basically diagnosed the media outlet's intent. They concluded the article was, and I'm quoting, constructed to suggest maliciously that visas approved or issued prior to January 1st, 2026 were not being honored.
Wow. That accusation that the media constructed the story maliciously, that really raises the stakes.
It does.
It signals that the ministry believes the Observer wasn't just making a journalistic error. They think they intended to cause political harm, create public panic.
It completely changes the nature of the dispute. It moves it from a factual disagreement to a full-blown confrontation over integrity and intent.
Right. The government is essentially saying, this wasn't an honest mistake about a date or a procedure.
This was a purposeful effort to sow public distrust.
And they did it using what the government claims are fabricated facts about a really high-stakes U.S. Antigua policy issue.
But, a denial is only as good as the facts you can bring to the table.
True.
So this is the point where the ministry had to shift from political condemnation to, well, a procedural deep dive of its own.
So let's get into those specifics. What were the technical and legal facts that the ministry used to just completely dismantle the Observer's story?
Okay.
Because this is where it gets really interesting. They basically force us, and you, the listener, to grapple with the actual mechanics of U.S. visa vetting.
And their defense wasn't just broad strokes, it was, as you say, forensic.
Yeah. So they start by addressing the central policy claim. Presidential Proclamation 1998.
Right. The thing the article claimed was the cause of all this.
So what did the ministry do?
They were extremely diligent about it. They didn't just rely on assumptions or, what they thought was right. They stated that they made direct inquiries with the relevant U.S. authorities.
They went straight to the source.
Straight to the source about this specific case from the Observer. And the confirmation they got back was unequivocal.
And that was?
That the specific case described in the newspaper had nothing to do with the presidential proclamation. Zero.
Okay, let's pause there for a second, because this is important. Why would alleging the involvement of a presidential proclamation be such a critical political move for a media outlet to make?
That's a great question. It's because proclamations are instruments of very high-level U.S. foreign policy.
Right, they're not just administrative rules.
Not at all. When a proclamation affects a country's citizens, it suggests a targeted political action. It's often related to national security or sanctions or major international disputes.
So the allegation then was that Antigua's entire group of students, or maybe even all its citizens, were being targeted by an official U.S. policy.
A policy that the Antiguan government was either powerless or maybe even unwilling to stop. That's the implication.
And by showing the proclamation was completely irrelevant, the ministry just instantly deflates that entire political crisis.
Completely. And it confirms their prior assurances remain intact. It's a huge first blow.
So if the proclamation wasn't the cause, what was the actual legal basis for the refusal? This is that technical pivot where we shift from what was alleged to be political targeting to just, standard everyday U.S. immigration law.
And the ministry was very clear. They stated the applicant was refused because they did not qualify for a visa under Section 214 of U.S. immigration law.
Section 214B.
And that shift is not just technical, it's a complete political reframing of the entire story.
How so?
Well, a refusal based on a presidential proclamation is a macro-level diplomatic failure for the government.
Right.
But a refusal under Section 214B, that's a micro-level administrative decision based entirely on the individual applicant's own circumstances.
Okay, so for you listening who might not be familiar with the maze of U.S. immigration law, can we do a little deep dive on this, the significance of Section 214B?
We absolutely should.
Why is this specific reason cited so often, and why is it so misunderstood?
Okay, so Section 214B is basically the foundation of U.S. non-immigrant visas.
So we're talking tourist visas, business visas.
And student visas, like the F1 in this case. The whole crux of the law is something called the presumption of immigrant intent.
The presumption of immigrant intent. Okay, what does that mean in practical terms for someone at the embassy?
It means that if you're applying for a temporary non-immigrant visa, let's say you're the student in this story, U.S. law dictates that the consular officer must assume you intend to immigrate permanently to the United States.
They have to assume that.
They must. It's the legal default position. It's an enormous burden of proof, and it's placed entirely on the applicant to prove them wrong.
So the student walks into that interview, and the deck is already stacked against them. They have to actively overcome this statutory presumption that they're secretly planning to stay forever.
Precisely. To overcome 214B, you, the applicant, have to demonstrate what are called strong ties to your home country.
In this case, Antigua and Barbuda.
Right. And those ties have to be so compelling that they would basically force you to return home after your studies are done.
Okay, now what actually constitutes a strong tie? And why might a young student from a smaller island nation like Antigua have a particularly hard time with this requirement, even if they have the best of intentions?
And that's where the context is so crucial. Strong ties are usually things like significant property ownership, deeply rooted financial investments, maybe a spouse and young children waiting for you.
A long-term, high-paying career you have to come back to.
Exactly. Or major financial commitments like a mortgage. For a young student, maybe just out of high school or starting their university journey, they often lack these deep, established ties.
Of course.
They might not own property, their financial assets might be limited, their career is still just a concept.
It's a structural disadvantage, really.
Right.
A wealthy applicant from a larger country might easily show millions in assets back home, which is a powerful reason to return.
Sure.
But a student from a small nation who is maybe relying on their family for support and has future job prospects, they have a much harder case to make against that legal presumption.
It's why 214B is the single most common reason for a visa refusal globally.
Wow.
And it is a technical statutory refusal. It's totally distinct from a security concern or a presidential proclamation.
So the ministry's ability to just point to 214B, that serves as their powerful technical proof.
It is. It proves the issue was not some diplomatic failure over high-level policy. It was a standard procedural failure by one individual applicant who couldn't meet the very stringent requirements of the law.
That detail just reframes the entire issue from a political scandal to a common, if unfortunate, administrative hurdle.
Absolutely. That reframing is essential.
But the ministry had one more critical technical element they needed to clarify.
They did.
And that was the difference between an indication of approval and final visa issuance.
Yes, because the observer's claim hung on that one word, canceled.
Right.
And that word was the second critical piece of misinformation. So the ministry had to basically give a public education lesson on complex bureaucracy.
So walk us through that process again, because this is the core of their factual defense against that charge of a cancellation.
Okay. So standard practice is that an indication of approval at the interview. You know, the consular officer says, everything looks good. That's essentially provisional.
It's not the end of the story.
Not at all. That positive signal does not constitute final U.S. visa issuance. It just means you passed phase 1, the interview.
Then what happens? That's when the mandatory vetting kicks in.
Exactly. All applications, but especially certain categories like student visas, undergo mandatory post-interview vetting.
And what does that involve?
It includes necessary security and background checks. Some of these require routing and review all the way back in Washington, D.C., often by different federal agencies.
And I imagine that can take some time.
It can take days, weeks, sometimes even longer, depending on the case. It is only after this entire mandatory vetting period is successfully completed that the Department of State authorizes the visa to be printed, stuck in the passport, and officially issued.
So in this case, if the student had a great interview and was told they were approved, but then the post-interview check flagged an issue, maybe their financial background was weaker than it seemed, or a tie to Antigua wasn't as strong as they thought, the application would be stopped right there.
Correct. And the definitive statement from the ministry on this was precise. No visa was issued in this case.
So since the visa never reached that final printed status,
it was stopped during the vetting period.
A cancellation was legally impossible.
Exactly. As the ministry correctly asserted, you cannot cancel something that was never formally issued in the first place.
So it was a refusal based on 214B during the post-interview vetting.
Not a cancellation because of Presidential Proclamation 1998.
And to really hammer this point home, the ministry used the physical evidence of the refusal notice itself.
They did. They leveraged the legal paperwork as irrefutable proof.
How so?
They pointed out that if the refusal had been based on the presidential proclamation, the applicant would have received a very specific, separate refusal notice.
One that explicitly cited the proclamation as the legal basis.
Right. And the ministry confirmed, quote, that did not occur. The absence of that specific notice confirms the absence of the proclamation's involvement.
And that, right there, is how they definitively win the facts war.
It is.
So to just sum up this whole section, the ministry used these highly specific legal and procedural facts, Section 214B, the multi-stage vetting process, the difference between refusal and cancellation, the physical refusal notice, to stand by its original statement.
Which was that validly issued visas are respected.
Exactly. So the claim of a canceled visa because of PP 1998 is, according to this deep dive into the official facts, entirely baseless.
And that level of detail, it shows the sophistication a smaller government needs to have to combat what they see as targeted misinformation.
Okay, so the facts were decided in that section.
Absolutely.
But now we move from these complex legal details to a simple, concrete piece of evidence.
And this is what moves the conversation from, say, journalistic error to what looks like outright fabrication.
This is the ministry's knockout punch against the Observer's credibility.
It really is. They didn't just rebut the claims. They exposed what they framed as malicious intent.
Right. The Observer article had published a photograph.
It had.
And it claimed that this photo showed a canceled visa directly related to the Antiguan student's case.
Presenting it as photographic proof of the government's failure.
So what did the ministry's examination of this photo reveal?
That the photo was, and I quote, entirely unrelated. And we need to slow down here and just appreciate the magnitude of this. This wasn't just like a generic stock photo of a passport.
No. So what specifically did this photograph, which was supposed to be proving a point about an Antiguan student visa, what did it actually show?
The image depicted a visa application that originated from India.
India.
A completely different continent, different country, different diplomatic post. And critically, it was for an H-1B work visa.
A work visa.
A work visa, not an F-1 student visa. The ministry was very clear that this photograph bore no connection to the alleged Antigua case.
Wow. That's stunning.
It is.
That moves way beyond sloppy journalism into what looks like active fraud on the public.
You'd have to think so.
If you're reporting on a student issue in the Caribbean and you use a photo of a high-skilled labor visa from South Asia, you are knowingly creating a false narrative.
It's the definitive proof point for the ministry's claim that the article was maliciously constructed.
Right.
And we can even, analyze the rhetorical choice of the fabrication. Why choose an H-1B visa photo?
That's a good question.
The H-1B is one of the most visible, politically contentious visa classes in the U.S. It's heavily associated with skilled labor, outsourcing the tech industry.
So by linking the Antiguan government's supposed failure to a high-profile work visa, the Observer was trying to give the story wider, more sensational political weight.
Exactly. More weight than a simple student visa refusal could ever really achieve on its own.
That makes a lot of sense. They weren't just looking for any canceled visa photo. They were looking for one that would maximize public outrage and connect the story to bigger global anxieties about immigration and labor.
That seems to be the play. So the government had the clear upper hand here.
They won the technical argument in Part 2 by citing 214B.
Check.
They won the argument on intent in Part 3 by revealing the fabrication of the photograph.
Check. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs successfully and completely dismantled the narrative of diplomatic failure.
So the facts are settled. A clear refusal, not a cancellation, and the evidence was a lie. This should have been the end of the story.
It should have been a clear win for Minister Greene.
But this is where the entire narrative pivots completely. If the case is closed on the visa, why did the public immediately open up a new, far more damaging case on the minister's own political leadership?
And this is the crux of our deep dive. This is the great irony of the whole situation. The official statement, which was so carefully designed to counter external misinformation, it immediately became a lightning rod for domestic political criticism.
And it was focused almost entirely on Minister Greene's perceived internal weakness.
Relative to his own Prime Minister, Gaston Brown, or GB as he's called.
So the public just filtered this diplomatic victory through the lens of a domestic rivalry.
Instantly.
Let's dive into the 6 public comments that are provided in the sources because they offer this deep and, frankly, explosive context.
They really do. The dominant theme, and you see it in the comments from Clady, Mr. Antigua, and Islandman 26, is this striking contrast.
The contrast between Minister Greene's competence in foreign affairs, which he just proved,
and his perceived incompetence in internal politics.
It's like the public is observing this phenomenon we could call selective courage.
That's a perfect way to put it. Clady sets this brutally honest tone right from the start. Chet, you are so quick to correct Observer, but silent as a church mouse when Gaston humiliates you. The contrast is immediate. Why fight so hard and so quickly against a media article that's clearly wrong, but then demonstrate complete silence and apparent subservience when you're facing criticism from the highest level of your own party?
And Mr. Antigua reinforces this with language that is, deliberately visceral. He calls the minister a spineless jerk pork for finding his voice to attack an article on Observer, but you can't respond to Gaston.
The implication is exactly what you said, selective courage. He's willing to fight a low-risk, weak opponent like the press, where victory is basically certain and it provides good optics.
But he's unwilling to engage the high-risk, strong opponent, the Prime Minister, for fear of damaging his career.
It's a classic political dilemma. By demonstrating this massive rhetorical and factual strength against the observer, he unintentionally highlights his lack of a public defense against his own boss.
So the public is essentially asking, if you are so competent and so factually correct that you can dismantle a media report using Section 214B of U.S. law, why can't you defend your own portfolio or even your own dignity against the prime minister?
And the political damage is immediate. Clytie even uses it to issue a direct warning.
Yeah, we in St. Paul might have rethink our decision.
This shows the public commentary isn't just, people venting online. It's a direct assessment of his electoral viability.
They're framing his subservience as a failure of leadership that could literally cost him his seat in Parliament.
The accusation of subservience is just relentless in these comments. Islandman 26 dismisses him outright as a potential future leader.
He says it plainly. Anyone that bows to any man is no leader but a follower.
So the public interpretation of this diplomatic success is completely inverted. It's not seen as a sign of ministerial strength.
No, it's a sign of a high-achieving official who lacks the internal political backbone that you need for true national leadership.
And that brings us to a really specific, highly damaging allegation that's raised by Brixtonian.
Right.
This one suggests the rivalry isn't just about harsh words, it's about operational functional sidelining.
Brixtonian asked for a comment on Gaston Brown allegedly throwing Greene under bus with Ron Sanders.
Yes, and specifically about them excluding the minister from recent talks on foreign affairs.
Which is his job.
It's literally his job title. This is the alleged smoking gun of the internal rivalry.
If that allegation is true, that the foreign secretary, who is responsible for the foreign policy portfolio, is being systematically excluded from key talks by his own prime minister and another official.
It's a functional sidelining of his entire ministry. It's a public humiliation of his office.
Let's analyze the practical implications of that kind of exclusion. If the foreign secretary isn't in the room for key foreign policy discussions, what does that even mean for his authority?
It means his role is ornamental. It's a title without power. If the prime minister and another designated official are handling the real foreign affairs talks, then Minister Greene's entire portfolio is rendered structurally hollow.
He's effectively been stripped of his authority.
He has. And this connects directly back to that theme of selective courage. He's out here fighting the observer over the nuances of U.S. law, a fight he can easily win,
while simultaneously being structurally undermined and humiliated within his own government on the issues that actually matter, like policy negotiation.
It paints that whole diplomatic denial we just analyzed in a completely new and very ironic light.
It does. The minister issues this rigorous, fact-based defense of Antiguan diplomatic assurances. He's trying to project control and competence.
But that very action now appears to be a compensatory move.
An attempt to look strong where he can control a narrative.
Precisely because he's losing control of his authority where it matters most, in the cabinet room.
So the narrative shifts entirely to what you call the leadership threat narrative.
Yes. Clytie just posits it directly, that Prime Minister Gaston Brown sees Greene as a threat to the leadership and is, quote, scared stiff.
So the alleged exclusion isn't just accidental bureaucracy.
No, it's interpreted as a deliberate, tactical move by the incumbent leader to diminish a potential rival before any kind of succession discussion can even begin.
And the public is openly assessing his suitability for that role. Island 26 frames the entire debate around the question of whether Greene should be the presumptive leader of Antigua if GB is gone.
And then concludes that true leaders blaze their own path, not be subservient to any man.
So this diplomatic statement, which was meant to settle a foreign affairs matter, has instead become a public referendum on the minister's moral courage and his potential to lead the country.
It's remarkable, and the public conversation even drags in these really complex geopolitical and ethnic nuances,
Right.
which just underscores the high level of anxiety surrounding this political rivalry. Corey Crook makes an explicit reference linking the internal politics to external power dynamics.
Yeah, watch out, that Chinese background might not please our U.S. masters. And then they ask if Greene would want Gaston Brown to end up in an NYC court.
That is a dense, very loaded comment.
It really is.
It links the minister's personal background, implied here to be Chinese, as a potential political liability in dealing with the United States, which is Antigua's powerful neighbor.
So the implication is that the prime minister's alleged sidelining of him might be some kind of preemptive move to manage U.S. relations.
Perhaps fearing that a change in leadership could trigger some kind of external scrutiny or political pressure from Washington.
It shows how quickly the public integrates these external diplomatic considerations, like relations with the U.S., into their internal political math.
It's the reality of politics in a small island nation. Domestic leadership choices are inherently linked to managing powerful external relationships.
Now, in the middle of all this scathing criticism of silence and subservience, we do have one lone voice of counter-argument.
We do. Winston Russell, who attempts to defend the minister's public silence regarding the prime minister.
So what's his take?
Russell suggests a different interpretation of that silence. He implies the minister doesn't need to address Brown publicly because, as he puts it, phone calls doesn't work anymore.
So he's suggesting that private, discreet communication is the appropriate way to handle it.
That's the idea, that a direct meeting or going through established party channels is the professional way to resolve internal disputes, rather than escalating them through the media and having a public fight.
So Russell sees the silence as political maturity and adherence to protocol.
Right.
Whereas a vast majority of the other comments see it as fatal weakness and spinelessness.
We have two completely opposing interpretations of the minister's actions, which just shows you how high the political temperature is running.
It's fascinating. What's truly compelling here is just the sheer velocity of the pivot.
Yes.
The official statement was precise, it was technical, and it was undeniable. The observer was wrong.
But the public immediately ignored the distinction between 214B and PP 19998. They just didn't care about that.
They took the minister's swift, effective defense of the government's external policy.
And they used it as a yardstick to measure his lack of defense against his internal rivals.
So the political drama, the exclusion, the threat narrative, the questions of spinelessness, that's far more immediate and relevant to the Antiguan public than any technical detail of U.S. immigration law.
The sources really force us to conclude that, in this context, winning the facts war externally is completely meaningless if you are simultaneously seen to be losing the power struggle internally.
And that's where the true story lies. A competent diplomat can win a factual debate using complex legal mechanisms.
But he can't win the political optics game if his every single move is being interpreted through the lens of this very visible rivalry with his superior.
His competence, ironically, just highlights his perceived weakness.
It does.
So, we started this deep dive following a ministerial denial about a canceled student visa, Presidential Proclamation 1998, and Section 214B of U.S. immigration law.
A lot of technical detail.
A lot. And we established the clear factual case made by the ministry regarding the non-issuance of the visa. We relied on the procedural steps of mandatory post-interview vetting.
And we saw the definitive proof of fabrication with that photographic evidence, the India H-1B photo, which, in the ministry's view, proved the observer's malicious intent.
The ministry won the facts war. Decisively.
No question. But we end up grappling with a far more complex issue.
Yeah.
The nature of political accountability and internal party dynamics in a really high-stakes environment.
The public reaction to this denial shows us that for many citizens, those technical details were just less important.
But much less important than the foreign secretary's relationship with his own prime minister, and whether he possesses the internal political fortitude you need for higher office.
Especially when he's facing what looks like structural sidelining.
This whole event serves as a perfect, crystalline example of how complex technical information, even rigorously sourced and presented legal information, is instantly filtered, distorted, and redefined through the lens of political personalities and rivalries.
Which raises an important question for you, the listener, to think about.
In a high-stakes political environment, when a formal statement is issued to defend national interests and correct the record, what is the public actually looking for?
Are they seeking the external facts that are being refuted? Or are they searching for evidence of the internal political vulnerabilities that the very act of refutation exposes?
And what does it say about the true nature of power when responding quickly and effectively to the press is seen by some as a sign of weakness against a colleague?
But silence against that same colleague is seen by others as spinelessness. The minister may have succeeded in his diplomatic mission.
But the public debate strongly suggests he failed the political test.
Thank you for diving deep with us.